Is on a set of groups and the reaction to these groups, and we've termed these groups single group protesters. These are groups that are advocating for change and engaging in behavior aimed to yield improvements for a particular group, and although it may have benefits for others as well, they're often named with a particular group in mind. These groups have been incredibly important throughout history. The history of the United States in particular is largely defined by many of these groups. They have been incredibly important for gaining equality and justice. We think about feminist organizations, we think about groups like Black Lives Matter, the Civil Rights Movement, all sorts of groups. These groups have advocated for equality on behalf of other groups. These groups, however, are often met with resistance, and where this work sort of came from was Heather and I discussing, we talk about politics a lot, and we found ourselves discussing in the news images like this from the Civil Rights Movement that look eerily similar to images like the one on the right, which is from Ferguson. Or laws like this one from North Dakota, which was attempted to be passed, which would have made it illegal for drivers to hit and kill protesters if those protesters are in the street. Would have made it okay to run over people who were protesting if they're in the street. This law did not pass, but it's also not the only instance of such a law being proposed in the United States. We know that protest movements often look better in hindsight. Most Americans, or many Americans, think that the Civil Rights Movement was a wonderful success for the country, but we also know that at the time of the movement, that most or many white people did not feel that way, and yet later they do. So we are absolutely certain that prejudice explains some of this disdain for groups. At no point during this talk will you hear me say that prejudice isn't a huge factor. And there's lots of factors that are probably at play here. One factor that Heather and I were particularly interested in, because we are people who study, among other things, the sense of belonging and how people respond when they feel as though they don't belong, was whether or not this might have to do with feelings of exclusion. We know that single group protesters advocate for a specific group, the specifically named targets of which may feel included. So it may be the case that a feminist organization working to gain equality for women, that women may feel particularly included, but that those who are not explicitly named, in that example men, may feel excluded. And this feeling left out may trigger negative evaluations and antisocial behavior. And there's a rich literature from the exclusion research showing that when people feel excluded, these things often occur. So we know that people are extremely sensitive to signs of social exclusion. We know that exclusion hurts even by despised outgroups. So when participants are not included in the cyberball game by members of the KKK, their immediate reaction is to still report feeling bad. No one in this room goes like, I don't know, I really want to be included by the KKK. Like, this is a group I would not want to be a part of. And yet, when people are excluded by members of the KKK, initially their response is very negative. As negative as when they're excluded by an outgroup or even by an in-group. We know that just being looked through as through air reduces belonging. So if I sort of look at you, you're clearly in my visual field, but I don't make eye contact with you, this makes people feel a little disconnected. It doesn't make people feel awful, but they feel a little disconnected. We know that single group protesters often do not explicitly mention or focus on one's own group membership, and this could trigger exclusionary feelings. We know that subtle linguistic cues can trigger feelings of exclusion. So when women read discussions of jobs where the pronoun he is used as the default, this makes women often feel more excluded. And we know that many of these groups have names that highlight just one group. And maybe if my group isn't named, I'm going to feel excluded by it. We know also from absolutely seminal work, and the work in which most of my work is based, from Plout and colleagues, that reactions to diversity policies are driven by perceived exclusion. So in one of the studies that they did, they had whites and non-whites read about diversity policies at an organization, and they rated to what extent do they endorse those diversity policies. And what they found was that, generally speaking, minorities were more endorsing of these policies than were whites, but that this was mediated by the extent to which they felt included by the organization having such policies. That effectively, when whites hear about diversity policies, and again, I'm speaking on average, there's plenty of whites who don't feel this way. Hopefully many of us in the room who identify as white would not feel this way. But they hear about diversity policies and they go, that's for them. That's someone else. That isn't about me. And that the more they feel included, the more they feel this is about me, the more they endorse those policies. We know, looking at implicit association work, that when whites rate the extent to which multiculturalism is tied to exclusion-related concepts versus to what extent is multiculturalism tied to inclusionary-related concepts, that whites tend to show much faster responses when multiculturalism is paired with exclusion than when it's paired with inclusion, suggesting that they see these policies as exclusionary, whereas minorities do not show a significant difference. We also know from Plout's work that when you first prime white participants to believe that these policies are inclusive of whites, that, hey, diversity includes you, that for whites for whom that wasn't explained, they show the bars on the right, where they seem to think of multiculturalism as about them, as exclusionary. But when you prime white participants to think about diversity as including them as well, suddenly they no longer show this exclusion bias and tied to multiculturalism. So based on the sensitivity people have to exclusion and based on Plout et al.'s work, we hypothesize a couple things. First, that perceived exclusion will predict more negative evaluations of single group protesters. Second, that the differences between insiders and outsiders being the people not named, not explicitly talked about by these groups, in evaluations of single group protesters will be mediated by perceived exclusion. And that among outsiders, making a single group protesting group appear more inclusive will improve evaluations of the group by reducing perceptions of exclusion. That's what we're going to be testing today. So I'm going to present a bunch of studies. Many of them are pretty similar to each other, particularly the first two, so they'll go by pretty quickly. In study one, we had 134 participants. These are non-white participants. These are non-black participants. This study was done at Penn State Abington. It's a very diverse campus. We have a lot of work showing what do you do when you have the insiders examined, but that's sort of a different talk, so if you're curious about that, we can talk about that afterwards. They read 6 objectives taken from the Black Lives Matter website. So these are actual objectives. They appear one at a time. They're on the screen for a minimum of 6 seconds to make sure they have enough time to read them. They are objectives like, we are committed to building a black woman-affirming space free from sexism, misogyny, and male-centeredness. We did not pick ones that we thought were particularly easy to digest for white participants. There are some on the website that are a little more that are a little more clear, or you could easily more sell in a particular way. That's not what we were looking for. We were looking for kind of what is the core mission. We then had them rate the group on their attitudes towards the group. The group is bad or good, the group is harmful or beneficial, how the group makes them feel, cold or warm, sad or happy, and to what extent do they support the group. I like this group, I support the objectives of this group, I would donate money to this group, etc. We then also asked them to rate how much they felt included by the group. And here I'm showing 2 different sets of items. Some of these items are about social items. If I wanted to join this group, they would accept me. And some of these are about the shared fate or objective item, which is I feel included by the group's objectives. So we thought maybe it's about belonging, but maybe it's about belonging because belonging will help me later. And so we kind of teased these out at start, and what we found is that they always group together and there's no difference. So from here on out, you'll hear me talk about these combined. First study is just correlational, and what we find are very strong negative correlations such that the more excluded you feel, the more likely you would be to be excluded from the group or think you would be excluded from the group, the less positive your attitudes are, your evaluations, the less positive the group makes you feel colder about the group, you feel more threatened, and the less likely you are to support the group. Now, one thing we didn't test, this was sort of a proof of concept study, we didn't test, well, what about, couldn't this all be due to prejudice? I bet that if you really don't like members, if you don't like African Americans, if you're high in anti-black prejudice, you might also, that may cause you to feel like you wouldn't be included. So in study 2, we basically did the exact same study. The difference is we also included prejudice measures. These were counterbalanced, so sometimes they occurred before people read about Black Lives Matter, sometimes they occurred at the end. And what we did is we included a set of feeling thermometers for 30 different groups, 2 of which were whites and blacks. We included other races, we included political groups, we included all sorts of groups. And so the feeling thermometers for whites and blacks is what we use as a prejudice measure. There's different ways to treat prejudice when using feeling thermometers. You can either use just the feeling thermometer score for blacks, or you can use it as a difference between white and black. No differences at all on our findings, whichever we did. In this study, we did whites minus blacks. And again, what we find is these exact same correlations after controlling for prejudice. So we're now can say with some confidence that this isn't just due to prejudice. It turns out if you have a really high prejudice, you also don't support these groups, but that there seems to be some variance that isn't solely explained by prejudice and is being explained by this feeling of inclusion or lack thereof. In study 3, we wanted to see to what extent can we expand this to another group. So we replicated basically study 2, but now with a feminist organization. These were statements taken from the Feminist Majority Foundation, which is a real group. We didn't tell participants that they were reading it from the Feminist Majority Foundation because we didn't think people would be as familiar with that group as they were with Black Lives Matter. We simply said, this is an organization, it's a feminist organization that advocates for women's equality, things like we promote nonviolence and work to eliminate violence against women. We then again had them do our dependent variables, same as before, and our measure of perceived exclusion. And as in study 2, we assessed sexism using the modern sexism scale, and that was counterbalanced as it was in the first study. What we find here first is an effect such that men tend to be less supportive, less positive evaluations, less positive feelings, and less support than women of this feminist organization, right? If we think about women as the insiders and men as the outsiders, again speaking on average, they are less supportive. We know that men also feel greater exclusion from this group. This group wouldn't want them as a part of it. We also find that men tend to exhibit more sexist attitudes than did women. And when we put both of these in as predictors of the dependent variable, we see that sexism does predict, a greater sexism predicts less support, less positive feelings, less support, as does perceived exclusion. So they both are related to the DV. But that only perceived exclusion, when you include both, perceived exclusion is the mediator, sexism does not mediate. So this is really being caused, in this case, not by sexist attitudes, but it's being caused by this feeling of perceived exclusion. In study 4, we wanted to try something a little different. We wanted to try to manipulate some things to see, can we push this around? So 257 participants were told they were going to read about a study on social activism, and they read about one of two groups. One we told them was Black Lives Matter. The other one was All Lives Matter. And what we did is we showed them the exact same messages from the Black Lives Matter website that we showed in study 1 and 2. The exact same messages. That one about a black woman affirming space. That's what we showed them. We just told them, oh, this is from Black Lives Matter. Or we told them, oh, this is from All Lives Matter. Had them do the same DV and same mediator. So let me orient to the graph. On the x-axis, we have All Lives Matter, and then Black Lives Matter, and then on the y-axis we have more of whatever it is we're measuring. We find that All Lives Matter resulted in participants having more positive attitudes, more positive feelings, more positive sense of support, and reduced feelings of exclusion relative to when they thought it was called Black Lives Matter. This is just that same pattern. What we see is that as exclusion goes up, people support these groups less, and that we get we actually get a reversal of mediation. So it's still significant, but it's not significant in the other direction. We don't have a particularly strong explanation for why it now goes in the other direction, but what we are finding is that we eliminate that initial effect. So again, and to some extent this is perhaps not shocking, right? We know that when you ask people, do you support Obamacare versus the Affordable Care Act, that people respond differently to this. So we know that labeling is a real thing. But if you take the exact same messages from Black Lives Matter and tell them it's from All Lives Matter, we get this difference in effect among white participants. Last study, 375 participants take a personality test. And what we're interested in here is, so we've shown this with Black Lives Matter, we've shown this with a feminist organization. We are concerned at this point about, we wish we could show this with more groups. And what we're really interested in is this a general social cognitive phenomenon? Is this something that happens with any group? Or is this something about Black Lives Matter and feminism? And so what we do here is we do a minimal groups test. We bring people in, we give them a personality test. We tell them you're either a member of the red group or the green group. We make a big deal. We say these groups really matter, and that they have lots of important predictors about what your life is going to be like and what your job's going to be like and all these things. And we'll tell you what they are later. So we don't give them any details. details about what it means to be a red person or a green person. We just tell them it's really important, and these are well-validated personality types within the psychological literature. We then have them read about a group, and the group is always the opposite color that they're assigned. So if they're a red person, they're reading about a green group, and if they're a green person, they're reading about a red group. And the way we define this group is that this group is advocating on behalf of itself because it thinks that it needs more. But the group is either very inclusive about that, like, this is good for everyone, and we welcome everyone, or it's not that it's particularly exclusive, it just talks about why it's important for them to receive these sorts of support and benefits. So in the red group, once more, these are people who identify as red personalities. They're standing up and asking for equal treatment. They argue that the use of such personality tests are problematic in business and educational settings because it cuts people into groups. It just talks basically about the fact that here's what we want and why it's important. In the high inclusion condition, there are some additional sentences added that say, like, these personality tests are problematic not only for them, not only for the red group, but they're also problematic for green personalities. And this is important for everyone, and it fears that other groups could be treated badly one day. It's sort of making this seem more inclusive. We then have our same DVs and mediator. Similar graph as before. Along the x-axis, we have benefits all versus benefits just the group. Along the y-axis, higher scores on our various DVs and mediator. And again, what we find is that attitudes are greater by out-group members when they are perceiving the group that is more inclusive, more positive feelings, more positive support, and less sense of exclusion. Just as before, this is just the regression terms. Again, perceived exclusion is negatively related to our DVs, so the more excluded you feel, you think you'd be to this group, the less positive you feel about the group. And again, we get full mediation when we add in perceived exclusion. So what we think we have found here is that perceptions of exclusion do indeed predict negative evaluations, feelings about, and support of single group protesters. There are other things that also predict this. We just think this is one of them. We think that it's possible that single group protesters might frame their messages to increase perceived inclusive scope to recruit allies. We also think that there are probably ways to do this that a group can do without changing its message at all. We also think that this information is really important for allies to know. That for me as an ally of Black Lives Matter, for me as an ally of feminist organizations, that the way I talk about it with other people like me, other people who are male, other people who identify as white, can be to talk about it as these groups are inclusive. That it's not just that that it turns out that African Americans being, that unarmed African Americans being shot less by police officers is good for me as a white person. It's good for everyone. And that equal treatment for women to get paid more money is good for me because I have an amazing daughter and because I have women in my life who I want to have equality, that these are good for me as well. We also think that it might have implications for aggressive reactions directed at single group protesters. We're doing some work right now looking at trolling behavior on groups on the internet, looking at basically how people respond to this, and then trying to see to what extent does that relate to their feelings of exclusion. That we can demonstrate the effect in minimal groups we think is very promising because it suggests that this isn't an artifact of existing groups. We've shown this with another group another minimal group where we told, it's technically not minimal, where we basically made up a group and said humanities majors demand action, and that we need more money because our professors don't have enough and we don't have enough and there's not enough resources, and we had psychology students kind of respond to this group. And again, when the message is framed in terms of, hey, all of you take humanities classes, and hey, it's good for all of us if the humanities have more, because then other groups because you can advocate for more as well, that psychology majors feel more included by the group and like the group more than when they just describe it as why it's good for them. We're again trying to generalize to other groups, and we're looking to include such expansions. As I said, we're looking at trolling behavior, and then last, I just shared this for the first time about a month ago at another conference, and I'll share with you guys. We're looking at how we can create virtual environments where we can put. So part of the issue here with some of these is that they're very explicit, right? We're saying this group is more inclusive of you. We're curious what would happen if we create a situation that is much more subtle, and so what we did is we created a rally, a Black Lives Matter rally, in a virtual reality setup. One of my students, Rob, did this. And so basically participants see themselves at this rally. A speaker is up on stage. It's giving audio that was actually taken from a real rally. And what we've done is we've manipulated the situation so that either the racial composition is 90% African American and 10% white, or we have it 50-50. And what we find in this study is that, and this is a really subtle manipulation, we don't ever mention anything about the race of anyone, and what we find is that when white participants go into the rally and it's 50-50, first they are sensitive to this fact. When we ask them when the study is all done to report on the percentages of what was the racial composition, they're actually very accurate at this. So they're picking up on this on their own, and then independent of that, they feel more included. They feel more welcomed at the rally, presumably because there's other people who look like them, and that this leads them to then have more positive evaluations of the groups. And so now we're looking at other ways to use this to kind of test some of these things in more subtle ways. Obviously, this is very different than going to an actual rally. I would never suggest otherwise. But this came about because I said, wouldn't it be cool? We can't manipulate these things at a real Black Lives Matter rally. And Rob said, we could in VR. And I went, what do you mean? And that's where this came from. So that's all I have.